Is this your first time here? The women giggled behind their fans. Eleanor Bennet showed a look of disdain and stepped inside. On either side of the entrance, a few burly guards stood watch. Eleanor Bennet glanced at them briefly, reminding herself to act cautiously. "Young master, you seem new here. Is this your first visit?" A middle-aged woman, extravagantly dressed, approached with a welcoming smile. She moved closer to Eleanor Bennet, scrutinizing her intently. "Madam Matchmaker, is Miss Jinhu here?" Eleanor Bennet glanced around at the 4 floors, each with its own distinct area. The carved railings and surrounding red silk drapes added a touch of opulence. "Are you looking for Jinhu?" The heavy scent of perfume on the matchmaker made Eleanor Bennet cough a few times. "Yes." Eleanor Bennet took out a gold bar and waved it gently in front of the matchmaker's eyes. "Is Miss Jinhu available?" Eleanor Bennet smiled, noticing the matchmaker's eyes light up at the sight of gold, realizing the deal was sealed. Of course. Please follow me upstairs." The matchmaker took the gold bar and led Eleanor Bennet to the upper floor. Ever since Jinhu fell out of favor with the crown prince, her visitors had become scarce. Meeting such a generous guest today was truly a blessing for the matchmaker. Eleanor Bennet ascended the stairs, noticing a large crowd gathered around the round stage in the center of the floor. "Madam Matchmaker, why is there such a crowd downstairs?" Eleanor Bennet inquired. "Ah, Master Simong, today is the auction for Miss Choo Choo's first night, the renowned beauty of Wai Hung Institute, which is why it's so lively," the matchmaker replied with a seductive smile. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel regretful, seeing yet another innocent girl being pushed into a life of debauchery. The matchmaker led Eleanor Bennet to a room and gently knocked on the door. Chapter 35, He Still Saves Her, March 3, Jinhu, come out and meet the esteemed guest. The matchmaker called out as she opened the door, gesturing inside. As Eleanor Bennet entered, she quickly sought the flower stand, spotting it near the beaded curtain. At that moment, a girl emerged from behind a screen, draped in sheer silk, her figure graceful. Eleanor Bennet observed her from head to toe, delicate eyebrows, skin as white as snow, and a plump appearance, indeed possessing some beauty. However, her attire and makeup seemed rather garish. "Yen Wood, come and greet the gentleman." The matchmaker beamed, instructing the girl to approach and pay her respects. Eleanor Bennet sat at the round table in the outer room, maintaining a neutral expression. "Sir, this is Miss Jinhu. I shall take my leave now." The matchmaker winked at Jinhu, signaling her to entertain the guest well. As the matchmaker closed the door, Eleanor Bennet stood up and removed her cloak. Her white silk robe, as radiant as the moon, further highlighted her exquisite beauty. "You are truly beautiful." Jinhu smiled, taking Eleanor Bennet's cloak and hanging it on the stand in the room. "This is for you, please accept it as compensation for your clothing." Eleanor Bennet placed a gold bar on the round table. Yen Wu looked at Eleanor Bennet's generous gesture and immediately realized that her identity was far from ordinary. "Jinhu thanks you." Yen Wu accepted the gold bar, but her mind was still speculating about Eleanor Bennet's true purpose for coming here. Suddenly feeling dizzy, she realized there was something wrong with the tea. Before she could utter a word, she collapsed onto the round table. Eleanor Bennet carefully checked to ensure she had fainted before gently carrying her into the inner room and laying her on the bed. Then, Eleanor stepped out to the flower stand outside the room, bent down, and counted the bricks. She lightly tapped a few times and heard something hidden. Eleanor then grabbed the fruit knife from the table, pried up one of the bricks, and uncovered a hidden layer beneath. From within, Eleanor retrieved a sandalwood box. Opening it, she found exactly what she was looking for, a ledger. She removed the ledger, returned the box to its original place, and carefully replaced the brick. Eleanor tucked the ledger securely under her cloak and left the room. Downstairs, the atmosphere was lively, filled with noisy chatter. Eleanor Bennet stood on the balcony and noticed a woman dressed in red, singing while playing an instrument. Her thin attire revealed a glimpse of a deep crimson undergarment beneath. Eleanor Bennet listened to the singing, finding it somewhat refreshing. A fleeting image crossed her mind. Eleanor slowly descended the stairs and got a clear view of the woman on stage. How could it be her? Eleanor recognized the girl she had saved at Spring Full Pavilion. Yet here she was, fallen into the depths of the red light district. Eleanor couldn't help but feel regretful, but tonight she had more urgent matters to attend to. Mundane affairs like this were beyond her intervention. Standing in a shadowy corner, Eleanor was curious about how the night would end for her. However, Eleanor was unaware that someone had been watching her ever since she entered the Y Fragrance courtyard. Her golden cicada shedding its shell tactic had indeed confused many prying eyes, but it failed to escape the notice of Charles King. At this moment, Charles King sat in the flower hall on the third floor, observing Eleanor Bennet calmly exiting Yenhua's room. Although her face was obscured by the cloak, his instincts told him that this woman had obtained the item he sought. Beside him, Blood Shadow and Shadow Marquis were stationed outside, puzzled as to why Eleanor lingered on the lower floor instead of leaving quickly. Blood Shadow glanced at his master behind the beaded curtain, sensing the cold calculation in his icy gaze. Eleanor Bennet, oblivious to the chilling gaze from above, still believed her plan was flawless. Little did she know, she had become the proverbial mantis stalking the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind her. Master, should we act now? Blood Shadow stepped forward to seek instructions. Charles King cast a warning glance, signaling him to retreat. He wasn't in a rush to seize the ledger. Now that it was in her possession, it wouldn't escape his grasp. He was more interested in understanding why Eleanor Bennet remained here. A woman disguised in a brothel was already a defiance of norms. Could she possibly be here to redeem a courtesan? He had initially suspected Daniel Moore, but if not for his spies planted on both sides, he might have been deceived by her today. Eleanor Bennet, your golden cicada shedding its shell ploy has truly been pushed to its limits. Charles King smirked coldly, she never failed to meet his expectations. At this moment, the singing had ended, and the stage became lively. Eleanor Bennet looked at those lecherous gazes and fully understood what those people were thinking. Truly, people are the same everywhere, like crows in a flock, they probably just stopped short of drooling. The brothel madam appeared just in time, signaling that tonight's golden bidding competition was officially starting. Gentlemen, tonight marks the debut of our top courtesan here at Daihun House. The rules remain the same, the highest bidder wins. Whether you get to take the beauty home tonight depends on how deep your pockets are. The madam's face was full of glee, as if she was certain she'd make a fortune tonight. The men below could no longer contain their impatience, urging the madam to speak less and start the auction quickly. Eleanor Bennet glanced at the pained expression of the girl on stage and couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. Perhaps the girl truly had an unspeakable sorrow. Chapter 36, Consequences of Guilt. Eleanor Bennet watched the silver tails being pushed forward incessantly, her heart stirred with compassion. Though she knew she could not protect the girl for a lifetime, she still felt pity for her fate. Having encountered her again, as if by destiny, Eleanor Bennet decided to help her once more. 500 taels. Eleanor Bennet unexpectedly bid, silencing the previously noisy hall in an instant. Everyone stared in astonishment at Eleanor Bennet, cloaked in a corner, full of suspicion. Who was this person, unwilling to reveal their face? The madam recognized Eleanor Bennet and was overjoyed. Indeed, a wealthy patron, tonight would be a profitable one for her. This young master bids 500 taels. Does anyone offer more? The madam glanced at the crowd of lustful patrons below, all of whom remained silent. 500 taels, not just for a courtesan's first night, but even for marrying off several daughters from respectable families, it would be more than enough. No matter how beautiful, she was still a courtesan, spending such an amount seemed excessive. Then, whoever bids higher will have Sophie Turner serve them tonight. 1,000 taels. Before the madam could finish her sentence, Blood Shadow interrupted. Eleanor Bennet curiously looked up to the third floor and recognized Blood Shadow. Inwardly, she sighed. Tonight, her identity would undoubtedly be fully exposed. If her guess was correct, Charles must be behind the beaded curtain. Despite all her calculations, she had ultimately fallen into his trap. My, this young master is truly generous. The madam was ecstatic at the impending windfall. While the crowd buzzed with chatter, Eleanor Bennet intended to slip away quietly. However, in her haste, she bumped into a group of people just entering. The leader, dressed in a purple robe, looked displeased as he glared at Eleanor Bennet. Where are your eyes, daring to bump into this young master? Several servants rushed forward, and Eleanor Bennet now saw clearly who had arrived. It was none other than Simon Carter, the spoiled young lord of the Duke of Stirling's residence. Truly, a nemesis encountered in a narrow alley. Eleanor Bennet kept retreating, her thoughts now in disarray. Coming to a brothel and not daring to show your true face? Today, I must see what kind of creature you are. Simon Carter stepped forward to snatch Eleanor Bennet's cloak. She dodged, but in doing so, her hat fell off, and her 3,000 strands of jet-black hair cascaded down like flowing water, revealing a beauty akin to a celestial maiden descending to earth. You're a woman. Simon Carter was astonished, seemingly finding Eleanor Bennet's face familiar. By now, the commotion had drawn everyone's attention, and they crowded around, curious as to why such a stunning woman would disguise herself as a man to enter a brothel. Eleanor Bennet stood there awkwardly, deeply uneasy, occasionally glancing towards the third floor. She was gambling, betting on whether Charles King, hidden behind the beaded curtain, would save her. At this moment, all her hopes rested on that cold and ruthless man. Miss, a woman entering a brothel is quite against the rules. The madam had rushed over by now, shocked to realize her earlier misjudgment. Little beauty, long time no see. Simon Carter stared at Eleanor Bennet with a lecherous expression. I don't recall being acquainted with you, young master. Eleanor Bennet immediately knew Simon Carter must have remembered the incident at Spring Full Pavilion last time. Young lord, this is an internal matter of De Xian Court. No need for you to trouble yourself. The madam, seeing Simon Carter, put on a flattering smile. Madam, look carefully, this woman belongs to me, not someone for you to meddle with. Simon Carter frightened off the burly men who were about to seize Eleanor Bennet. So, it was a misunderstanding. Please forgive my poor eyesight, young lord. The madam quickly signaled her subordinates to retreat. Beauty, it's been a while, and you've grown even more enchanting. Simon Carter stepped forward, attempting to caress Eleanor Bennet's cheek, but she skillfully avoided him. Simon Carter, you're nothing but a beast. Eleanor Bennet glanced up at the still silent third floor, the faint hope in her heart completely extinguished. Could it be that tonight, she would truly have to endure humiliation at the hands of this scoundrel? King Edward, why are you here? Eleanor Bennet suddenly shouted behind Simon Carter, startling him. Taking advantage of the moment, she dashed outside. Realizing he had been tricked, Simon Carter quickly led his men in pursuit. Inside the fragrant pavilion, chaos erupted as everyone stared in confusion at the unfolding drama. On stage, Sophie Turner recognized Eleanor Bennet. Once again, she was saved by her. Worry filled Sophie's heart, uncertain if Eleanor could escape this calamity. Charles King, cloaked in his dark attire, silently left the sordid scene like a ghost, exuding an overwhelming aura of menace. Eleanor Bennet ran onto the street with Simon Carter hot on her heels. The streets were now deserted, and who would dare intervene in such a matter? Despite her determination, Eleanor, being a frail woman, could not outrun the burly men chasing her. Exhausted, she was eventually caught by Simon Carter. My beauty, meeting you again must be fate. Why not come with me to the Duke's residence? I promise you will not be mistreated. Simon Carter said, his tone shameless as he tried to persuade her. Simon Carter, stop dreaming in broad daylight. Let me go if you know what's good for you. Eleanor Bennet retorted, stepping back cautiously, aware that she was no match for him. Prey already in my grasp, how could I let it go? Simon Carter lunged forward, grabbing Eleanor, intending to drag her back to the Duke's residence. Suddenly, his hand was gripped tightly, forcing him to release her in pain. A group of black-clad figures appeared out of nowhere. Eleanor recognized the cloaked figure, it was Charles King. She exhaled in relief, gratitude evident in her gaze. Who are you people? How dare you meddle in my affairs? Simon Carter felt an intense killing intent and began to back away slowly. Blood Shadow, take care of them. Cripple this scoundrel, but leave him alive. Charles King commanded coldly. In the blink of an eye, he swept Eleanor into his arms and leaped away, with Shadow following closely behind. Blades flashed, and one by one, Simon Carter's men fell. Left trembling, Simon Carter begged, spare me, great hero. Gone was his earlier arrogance. He had recognized the exquisite swordsmanship, it belonged to the Cold Shadow sect. Who was this woman to be under their protection? Blood Shadow ignored his pleas. The wind howled, blades fell, and all trouble seemed to vanish with the breeze. Only Simon Carter's pitiful cries echoed through the cold winter night. Charles King brought Eleanor Bennet to a hot spring hidden within a bamboo forest. Eleanor observed Shadow, noting his attire resembled Blood Shadow's and suspecting his martial skills were equally formidable. She found it peculiar, whenever she came here, the place was eerily silent, desolate, and devoid of life. Could there be some hidden mechanism that kept even birds away? Come inside, woman. Charles King's voice carried a hint of irritation as he stepped into a bamboo house. Shadow looked at Eleanor with disbelief. This bamboo house was a place even they could not enter, yet this woman. Shadow immediately understood the fleeting smile that had appeared on his master's face. At that moment, Blood Shadow returned to report. Seeing Eleanor Bennet's figure entering the bamboo house, he turned and departed without a word. Blood Shadow, have you cleaned it up? Shadow stepped forward and asked. Yes. Shadow observed Blood Shadow's expression, which seemed unusually calm. Blood Shadow, that woman. Shadow couldn't suppress his curiosity and asked. After all, Blood Shadow had always been by their lords' side and might know something. Shadow, it's best if you don't ask about her. Just follow the Lord's orders. Blood Shadow was unwilling to say more. Their lord's thoughts were not something they could fathom. Shadow realized he had overstepped, but judging from Blood Shadow's demeanor, that woman likely posed no harm to their lord. The four of them, once orphaned and destitute, had all been saved and trained in extraordinary martial arts by the old man of the Snow Mountain, Grandmaster Anthony. 10 years ago, they were ordered by their master to descend the mountain and serve their lord. They had sworn on the Snow Mountains to remain loyal to their lord for life, even if it meant death. Over the past decade, their lord had transformed from a frail child into the cold, ruthless, and cunning prince he was today. No one could imagine the hardships he endured during that time. Yet today, for a woman, their lord was willing to confront the Duke of Stirling head-on, a move entirely out of character. Moreover, Eleanor Bennet was the first woman to step into the imperial hot springs. Aside from Blood Shadow, the other three couldn't comprehend it. What exactly had happened in the capital during their absence? Eleanor Bennet trembled as she stepped into the hot spring. Through the rising steam, she saw Charles King sitting on the platform. He had removed his cloak and outer garments, wearing only a thin purple robe embroidered with cloud and dragon patterns. The color accentuated his extraordinary demeanor. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but stare at him in a daze. "Is there a flower growing on my face?" Charles King teased, his tone laced with humor. His ambiguous gaze made Eleanor Bennet quickly avert her eyes, her face flushing red. It was unclear whether it was from the heat or her embarrassment at his words. Regardless, her crescent-like cheeks were now as rosy as the evening clouds, exuding a gentle beauty that couldn't be concealed. "Come closer," Charles King said, his gaze on Eleanor Bennet stirring a ripple of emotion within him. "Thank you, Your Highness, for saving my life today. However, I have been away from the Bennet residence for too long and cannot stay any longer," Eleanor Bennet replied. She had no intention of walking into a trap. She carried an important item on her, and although she suspected Charles King had appeared tonight because of it, she saw no need to bring it up unless he did. The esteemed daughter of the Bennet family, the top female official of the Northern Kingdom of Britain, since when did you become so cautious with your words and actions? Charles King's words were clearly tinged with mockery. "I always exercise caution in both words and actions." "What does Your Highness mean by such a statement?" Eleanor Bennet sought to conceal her intentions, resolutely refusing to admit anything. If the world were to discover that the young lady of the Bennet family barged into a brothel late at night, imagine the uproar it would cause, Charles King remarked calmly, sipping his tea with an air of leisure. "I was merely curious. Who would have thought that a prince with such influence over the court would frequent places of indulgence?" Eleanor Bennet retorted with a hint of sarcasm, refusing to show weakness. "Eleanor Bennet, I truly admire your cleverness. But had it not been for me tonight, you would already be lying in Simon Carter's bed by now, with no energy left to spar words with me," Charles King reminded her, seemingly alluding to the favor he had done for her that evening. "I would never dare forget Your Highness's great kindness. I sincerely thank you for your assistance tonight." Eleanor Bennet bowed respectfully, already anticipating that Charles King would quickly reveal his true intentions. "I never save someone useless. The brilliant mind of the Bennet family must surely know what I want. Charles King's gaze turned cold, a clear warning to Eleanor Bennet. Forgive my ignorance, but I truly do not know what your highness desires, Eleanor Bennet replied, though she was certain that the cunning man before her had calculated everything long ago, merely waiting for her to fall into his trap. She had hidden all traces, yet in the end, she could not escape his watchful eyes. Was she destined to be under his control? Eleanor Bennet sighed deeply, realizing that all her previous efforts had been in vain. The only protective charm she had fought for her family was now lost, and her dream of leaving this chaotic world had completely shattered. In a flash, Charles King was standing before Eleanor Bennet. She instinctively stepped back in fear. Charles King, you, Eleanor Bennet continued retreating, but behind her was the lake, leaving her with no escape. The consequence of defying me is always the same. Charles King's deep eyes were as cold as ice. Charles King, if you take another step, I'll throw this into the lake. Eleanor Bennet pulled out a notebook, ready to toss it into the water. She could feel the danger closing in on her. Charles King stared intently at the item in Eleanor Bennet's hand, his eyes filled with anticipation. The object he had been searching for all these years was found by a woman. Eleanor Bennet, hand it over to me. You know I have never succumbed to any threats, Charles King warned, glaring at Eleanor Bennet. Charles King, I never wanted to be part of this whirlwind, but I was forced into it. I know you've always used me. Today, you've achieved your goal, and you have no reason to keep me. If it's death either way, why should I let you have it so easily? Eleanor Bennet sneered, tossing the notebook into the water, unexpectedly losing her balance and falling in as well. Charles King lunged to grab the notebook, throwing it onto the bed. When he turned back to save Eleanor Bennet, it was too late. Both of them fell into the water. Eleanor Bennet never expected Charles King would try to save her, nor did she expect him to fall into the water with her. She floated on the surface, looking at Charles King before her. Had she misjudged everything? Did he not want to kill her to silence her? Eleanor Bennet was utterly confused by this scene. Was his intention genuine or accidental? Woman, when did I say I wanted to kill you? Charles King looked at Eleanor Bennet, emotions overwhelming his heart. Charles King leaned down to kiss the bewildered Eleanor Bennet. He admitted he had used her before, but tonight, he had completely abandoned that intention. However, he didn't want to admit this reason. Eleanor Bennet's mind went blank, like a docile rabbit, allowing Charles King to control her. She had lost all the courage she had moments ago. His words echoed in her mind. Had he never intended to kill her? Eleanor Bennet was filled with questions, completely unaware that he was removing her clothing piece by piece. When she regained her senses, they were facing each other without any barriers. Chapter 36, Abandoning His Descendants, 3/3, Charles King, you. Eleanor Bennet intended to slap him, but he held her tightly in his arms. They were so close that their breaths mingled, the intimate scene causing Eleanor Bennet's face to flush with embarrassment. Woman, do you think I'd give you another chance? Charles King smirked, his restless hands slowly sliding down, causing Eleanor Bennet to shiver. Eleanor Bennet kneed Charles King in a sensitive spot, but he dodged in time, though he was still slightly affected. Eleanor Bennet took the opportunity to swim towards the shore, but unexpectedly, Charles King pulled her back into his embrace. Woman, are you seeking death? Charles King restrained Eleanor Bennet's hands behind her back, then bent down to kiss her chest. Eleanor Bennet struggled in pain, kicking wildly but unable to reach him. Transparent tears rolled down Eleanor Bennet's cheeks. She hadn't been humiliated by Simon Carter tonight, yet she couldn't escape Charles King's grasp. Eleanor Bennet gradually calmed down, allowing Charles King to kiss her. If destiny was unavoidable, she would rather endure him than be humiliated by Simon Carter, that beastly man. At least Charles King was genuinely pure. Eleanor Bennet blamed herself for having such strange thoughts. Woman, in this life, you can only be the woman of this king. Remember this forever. Charles King kissed away the tears at the corners of Eleanor Bennet's eyes, then released her and left alone. Eleanor Bennet was astonished to see Charles King let her go. He changed into clean clothes, sat on the bed, and began looking through a notebook. Woman, where is David King now? Charles King's eyes flashed with anger as he tossed the notebook aside. Eleanor Bennet suspiciously looked at Charles King. Could there be something wrong with the notebook? She quickly left the hot spring, went behind the curtain to change into clean clothes, picked up the notebook from the ground, and carefully flipped through it. After reading a few pages, Eleanor Bennet suddenly realized that David King had deceived her. David King is still at Harmony Hall. Eleanor Bennet realized that perhaps Daniel Moore was in danger. Blood Shadow. Charles King called out. At your service. Blood Shadow quickly awaited outside the screen. Go to Harmony Hall and bring David King to Peach Blossom Manor. Blood Shadow received the order and departed. I think we need to find one more person. Eleanor Bennet suddenly remembered Yen Ru at Eastyoung Court, fearing she had already seen through everything. Who? Charles King asked coldly. Eastyoung Court, Yen Ru. Eleanor Bennet replied. Shadow. You heard her, go quickly. Charles King instructed outside the screen. At your command. Eleanor Bennet watched the figure disappear in an instant outside, feeling anxious. Did they see the ambiguous scene between her and Charles King in the water earlier? Eleanor Bennet sat on the bed, her face flushed, alternating between light and shadow. Charles King, what secret does this notebook hold? Why do so many people want to obtain it? Eleanor Bennet couldn't believe that everything she meticulously arranged had now become a farce. This notebook records how David King and the Duke of Stirling have exploited the blood and sweat of the people over the years, as well as the directions of their transactions. Possessing it means holding solid evidence of the Duke of Stirling's crimes against the nation and its people. This is enough to uproot his entire faction, Charles King said coldly, with a hint of regret. He had calculated everything but overlooked Yen Nu from the Yen Hung Inn. Eleanor Bennet suddenly awakened. Indeed, the Duke of Stirling was not a good man. Both King Edward and Charles King wanted to obtain this notebook, but only to expand their own power. I don't understand. Why would David King risk his life and refuse to hand over the notebook? He must know that the Duke of Stirling would definitely kill him to silence him. Eleanor Bennet couldn't comprehend, what exactly was David King protecting at this moment? David King didn't deceive you, he just underestimated Jianhu. Charles King seemed to realize something. If the Duke of Stirling gets the notebook, David King will definitely be killed. By then, all evidence will completely disappear. Eleanor Bennet realized the gravity of the situation. She had been too arrogant. Woman, you're very intelligent, but you underestimate your opponent's capabilities, Charles King chuckled lightly. Why not just say outright that I'm arrogant? Eleanor Bennet sighed, looking like a bullied little rabbit. Let's go. Charles King draped a snow-white fur coat over himself, preparing to leave. Go where? Eleanor Bennet looked at his calm face, which showed no urgency. "You'll know when we get there." Charles King placed a fox-fur cloak as white as snow over Eleanor Bennet's shoulders, an action that left her stunned. If Charles King didn't have such a sinister personality, he might actually be a very considerate man. Eleanor Bennet thought, finding herself unusually curious about him. Curious about his sorrows, about the reasons behind his sinister nature. Surely, he was a man full of mysteries, evoking a sense of pity in others. Chapter 37, Hanging by a thread. Eleanor Bennet followed Charles King out of the bamboo forest, where a carriage was already waiting. She saw several men dressed in black respectfully bow to Charles King. The attire of the leader was identical to Blood Shadow. "Susie, where is David King now?" Charles King asked anxiously as soon as he entered the carriage. "My lord, he is currently in Peach Blossom Manor." However, Susie hesitated. "However, what?" Charles King's expression darkened, and Eleanor Bennet suddenly had a bad feeling. Harmony Hall was attacked by a group of strangers. Dr. Moore was seriously injured and is still unconscious. Susie replied. "Where is Daniel now?" Eleanor Bennet's heart sank. She had indeed caused him trouble. Charles King looked at her tense expression, and a trace of bitterness rose in his heart. "At Harmony Hall." Phantom glanced at his master's expression, hesitating as he spoke. "Charles King, take me to Harmony Hall immediately." Eleanor Bennet, almost losing her composure, called out Charles King's name without any restraint. Susie secretly broke into a cold sweat for her. There was likely no one else who dared to speak to the master in such a manner except her. "Susie, head to Harmony Hall." Charles King calmly commanded, showing no anger at Eleanor Bennet's audacity. Susie looked at her master in astonishment, then steered the car toward the bustling city. Indeed, Eleanor Bennet was just as Shadow had described, truly extraordinary. Sitting in the car, Eleanor Bennet's heart was in turmoil, her mind in chaos. The guilt weighing on her felt like a heavy stone pressing on her chest, leaving her nearly breathless. "You seem overly worried about him," Charles King remarked, his expression calm as he observed Eleanor Bennet. "He's involved because of me. If I hadn't asked him to save David King, none of this would have happened." Tears welled in Eleanor Bennet's eyes as she could no longer suppress her emotions. "Eleanor Bennet, if you've already decided to drag him into this, why put on this act of being torn apart?" Charles King sneered coldly. "Charles King, I am not you, nor can I be as cold and unfeeling as you. The world isn't just about using others. There's family, love, and friendship. You may never have had them, but you can't deny their existence," Eleanor Bennet retorted, angered by his heartlessness toward Daniel Moore. After all, they were once fellow disciples. Her heart grew cold. Was there anything in this world that could still matter to him? The carriage fell into silence, neither of them speaking further. Inside, Charles King felt a mix of emotions. What exactly was between him and her? Love or friendship? He had seen through Daniel Moore's feelings, but what about hers? The carriage soon arrived at Harmony Hall. Eleanor Bennet hurriedly got out and rushed inside. Seeing the mess in the shop and the injured workers, her anxiety grew even more intense. She quickly made her way to Daniel Moore's room in the backyard. Dark Shadow stood guard at the door. Seeing Eleanor Bennet stagger toward him, he was startled and immediately stepped forward to block her. "Move aside." Eleanor Bennet glanced at his attire and quickly realized he was also one of Charles King's men. "Who are you?" Dark Shadow asked, looking at her. Her delicate face was still streaked with tears, and she wore a luxurious snow fox fur coat, clearly marking her as a noble lady. Dark Shadow, let her in. At that moment, Charles King entered the inner courtyard, followed by Susie. Dark Shadow quickly bowed respectfully, surprised that his master had come to Harmony Hall. Eleanor Bennet cast a cold glance at Charles King before turning and walking into the room. Eleanor Bennet approached Daniel Moore, who was still unconscious. His left shoulder was a bright red, seemingly still bleeding, and his entire body was burning hot. Her professional instincts told her that Daniel Moore was in critical condition. Eleanor Bennet removed her snow fox fur cloak and used scissors to cut the shirt on Daniel Moore's left shoulder, discovering that the sword wound had pierced through the shoulder blade, just a few centimeters from the heart. She realized he needed immediate surgery. She temporarily stopped the bleeding and knew she urgently needed her medical kit. Eleanor Bennet stepped out of the room and saw Charles King sitting and drinking tea at the stone table in the courtyard. She stood at the door, looking directly at Charles King. She noticed 3 men standing behind him, one of whom was Blood Shadow. Blood Shadow, could you please go to the Bennet residence and fetch my medical kit from the room? Eleanor Bennet looked at Blood Shadow with a pleading gaze. He was the person she knew best, and he was also the most familiar with the Bennet residence. Blood Shadow glanced at Charles King but dared not act without permission. Go quickly and return swiftly. As soon as Charles King finished speaking, Blood Shadow immediately leaped away. How is our senior brother? Charles King asked nonchalantly. In critical condition. Eleanor Bennet didn't want to say more to him and quickly headed to the kitchen. She needed to prepare before the surgery. In this scarce situation, she could only use the most basic method to sterilize the instruments. Charles King pondered over Eleanor Bennet's dark expression and her words in the carriage. He truly didn't understand what love was, nor did he feel the need to understand. You two, see if there's anything you can do to help. Charles King instructed Dark Shadow and Shadow behind him, then proceeded to Daniel Moore's room himself. Eleanor Bennet wanted to boil a pot of water but had never used an ancient stove before and was fumbling with it when Dark Shadow and Shadow entered. Master Bennet, our Lord instructed us to assist. Eleanor Bennet looked at them appreciatively, her eyes glancing towards the courtyard, but the cold figure was nowhere to be seen. I need a pot of hot water and alcohol, Eleanor Bennet instructed, and the two immediately set to work. About half a cup of tea later, Blood Shadow completed his mission and returned with Eleanor Bennet's medical kit. She placed all the instruments in the pot to boil, astonishing the 3 onlookers with her actions and the items in the pot. What kind of hidden weapons were these? Eleanor Bennet boiled all the surgical instruments, then covered them with sterilized cotton cloth. Finally, she carried everything into Daniel Moore's room. At this moment, Eleanor Bennet saw David King in the room and was slightly surprised. She had thought he had already left. Eleanor Bennet removed her intricate coat, changed into a simple surgical outfit she had designed herself, tied her hair up neatly, and finally donned a white cap. Once everything was ready, she began carefully washing her hands. David King observed Eleanor Bennet in her pristine white attire, his eyes filled with astonishment. Stop staring and give me a hand. Eleanor Bennet glared at David King. At this moment, she could only rely on him. This woman, do you intend to order this king around? David King couldn't believe it and coldly looked at Eleanor Bennet. People's statuses may vary, but lives are absolutely equal. Eleanor Bennet began arranging the surgical tools, wasting no time arguing with him. What do you want me to do? David King stood up and asked her. Take off all of Daniel's clothes and step aside. Don't touch anything here. Eleanor Bennet said seriously, leaving Charles King with no choice but to comply. Eleanor Bennet began sterilizing and cleaning Daniel Moore's wounds with alcohol. This peculiar method of hers was no longer unfamiliar to Charles King. Eleanor Bennet used acupuncture to block several vital acupoints, and by this time, the bleeding had ceased. She then laid out a surgical mat and began the operation. Eleanor Bennet first tied off the deep blood vessels within the wound and then stitched layer by layer. It took her a full hour to complete the procedure. At this moment, Blood Shadow entered with a bowl of medicine and was visibly surprised to see Charles King. Blood Shadow, give it to him to drink. Eleanor Bennet removed her white coat and washed her hands with alcohol. She glanced at Daniel Moore, who lay weakly on the bed, unable to hide her concern. After all, in this era without antibiotics, her greatest fear was infection. Eleanor Bennet left the room alone and went to the kitchen to wash the tools. She couldn't help but feel heartbroken that the custom-made tools Daniel had ordered ended up being used on his own body. No matter what, she had to save Daniel Moore. When Eleanor Bennet returned to Daniel Moore's room, Charles King had already left, leaving only Blood Shadow behind. Master Bennet, the Lord had an urgent matter and left. He instructed me to stay and assist. Blood Shadow said respectfully. Thank you, Blood Shadow. Eleanor Bennet, visibly exhausted, looked at Daniel Moore, who was still feverish on the bed, and couldn't help but feel uneasy. Master Bennet, Mr. Moore is a man of great fortune, you needn't worry too much. Blood Shadow seemed to notice Eleanor Bennet's anxiety and quickly offered reassurance. Blood Shadow, has Yan Wu from Jianhu Institute been captured yet? Eleanor Bennet recalled this key figure, certain that the records had been tampered with by her. When our men arrived, there was no one left there. Do you know who attacked Harmony Hall? Eleanor Bennet was confident that David King's fake death had no flaws, yet the news of his hiding at Harmony Hall had been leaked. Could it be that she still hadn't escaped the watchful eyes following her? The assassin was highly skilled, but their martial arts style couldn't be identified. Fortunately, the master had illusion and dark shadow secretly monitoring Harmony Hall, which prevented David King from escaping. So, you mean those people weren't there to kill, but to rescue someone? Eleanor Bennet caught the hidden meaning in the words, confirming that this group and the assassins who appeared in the palace were not on the same side. That seems to be the case. Blood Shadow affirmed Eleanor Bennet's speculation. When did David King realize I had deceived him? Eleanor Bennet knew that from the very beginning, David King had fully grasped the situation, and her schemes had not escaped his notice. I dare not speculate on this matter. The master only instructed me to monitor you and Mr. Moore and to clear all obstacles for the two of you. Eleanor Bennet looked surprised. No wonder everything had gone so smoothly, it turned out he had been secretly helping all along. However, no matter how meticulous his calculations, he still overlooked one person, Jianhu. Eleanor Bennet could only feel how unpredictable people were. David King would surely handle these matters properly. As for her, the most important thing now was to save Daniel Moore. She was exhausted and no longer had the strength to deal with anything else. Eleanor Bennet went to the front hall to prepare medicine for Daniel. The immediate priority was to reduce his persistent high fever. Daniel Moore regained consciousness after 3 days. When Eleanor Bennet saw him awake, she felt a mix of joy and sorrow. This proved that he had passed the most critical phase. Daniel. Eleanor Bennet softly called out to Daniel Moore, who was still groggy, her eyes shimmering with tears. Eleanor Bennet. Are you all right? Daniel Moore, just waking up, immediately inquired about her safety, making Eleanor Bennet feel even more heartbroken. I'm fine. Eleanor Bennet sat by the bed, checking his pulse. Don't cry, am I not here, safe and sound? Daniel Moore wanted to wipe away the tears on her face but was powerless to move. Yet, his heart felt incredibly warm. Knowing she would worry, grieve, and shed tears for him, he felt his life was already complete. Daniel, I'm sorry. Eleanor Bennet still blamed herself, her tears falling onto her dress like threads of sorrow. Eleanor Bennet, there's no need for those 3 words between us. Daniel Moore weakly held her soft hand, his gaze full of contentment. She was more important to him than his own life. Daniel, you must rest well. You have to recover. Eleanor Bennet clasped his hand tightly, her eyes filled with encouragement. All right. Daniel Moore replied. In this moment, he felt immense happiness. After tucking him in, Eleanor Bennet went out to fetch medicine. Unexpectedly, in the courtyard, she saw David King hurriedly approaching. Chapter 37, Could he be a Duan-shou? 3/3, Is he doing better? David King's indifferent face showed no emotion. He just woke up, Eleanor Bennet replied curtly, heading toward the main hall, her demeanor somewhat cold. David King did not enter but sat in the courtyard drinking tea. Nearby, Blood Shadow and Shadow exchanged puzzled glances. Their master had clearly come to see her, so why wasn't he saying anything? Eleanor Bennet brought the medicine back and, seeing him still there, intended to head straight into Daniel Moore's room. That woman, I have something to discuss with you. David King hesitated for a long time before finally speaking. Daniel just woke up and needs someone to care for him. Eleanor Bennet stood with her back to him, seemingly unwilling to converse further. Blood Shadow, take good care of Mr. Moore. David King, upon hearing the name, Daniel, couldn't suppress his fury. He forcibly grabbed Eleanor Bennet to take her away. David King, what are you doing? You're insane. Eleanor Bennet shouted angrily as he held her tightly, but her protests were in vain. Eleanor Bennet was carried onto the carriage by David King. At this moment, she truly wanted to stab this cold-blooded man. Charles King, where exactly are you taking me? You'll know when we get there, Charles King replied, ignoring her current anger, his focus on reading a book. Exhausted, Eleanor Bennet leaned against the side of the carriage. She hadn't slept for 3 days and nights, and now, with Daniel finally awake, her tension eased. Unconsciously, she drifted off to sleep. When Eleanor Bennet woke up, she was surprised to find herself lying in Charles King's arms. Listening to the sound of his heartbeat, so clear that it left her astonished, she noticed that Charles King was fast asleep. Eleanor Bennet gazed at his handsome face, untouched by any trace of the mundane world. His long, elegant eyebrows and straight, high nose seemed as though they were drawn from a painting. She realized how peaceful he looked while sleeping, an unusual kind of tranquility. Unconsciously, she found herself reluctant to let go of the sensation of leaning against him like this. Looking around, Eleanor Bennet noticed they were still inside the carriage, but now there were a few heaters and a warm fur blanket added. Outside, the sky was pitch black, and the carriage had come to a stop. Where had they arrived? She must have been asleep for a long time. You're awake. Charles King looked at the woman in his arms, a fleeting trace of loss crossing his eyes. Eleanor Bennet, slightly embarrassed, moved away from his embrace. The icy wind from outside blew in, making her shiver. "It's cold outside, come here." Charles King pulled her back into his arms. He suddenly felt reluctant to let go of her scent and this peaceful atmosphere. "Why didn't you wake me up?" Eleanor Bennet didn't resist, instead obediently lying in his arms like a small rabbit. She had long realized that there were always tangled emotions between her and him, emotions that could never be severed. But she was certain these feelings were definitely not love. To love a man like him would only bring a lifetime of pain. She wasn't foolish enough to invite such suffering upon herself. She wasn't the kind of woman who couldn't live without love, otherwise, in her past life, she wouldn't have ended up as a single woman growing old alone. You wouldn't have stayed asleep anyway. Charles King seemed to be hiding something. Eleanor Bennet didn't want to press further. Some things were better left unsaid. "What do you need me for?" Eleanor Bennet stood up, tidying her slightly messy hair. Staying like this, it seemed they would have to spend the night. "Get David King to talk." Charles King didn't stop Eleanor Bennet, only gently draped his wool coat over her shoulders. Why was this foolish woman always dressed so lightly? Couldn't she feel the cold? His action brought back a similar scene at the hot spring to her mind. Eleanor Bennet stroked the soft wool, watching Charles King step out of the carriage. Even though he wore an outer coat, with his aversion to the cold, could he really endure it? Eleanor Bennet quickly got off the carriage and draped the cloak back over him. "I'm not as weak as you think, but you..." Eleanor Bennet noticed the complexity in his eyes and realized she had acted too bluntly. Below the carriage, dozens of guards were waiting, with the leader holding a snow mink cloak. Eleanor Bennet looked up at the sign above the door and realized this was Prince Charles's residence. "Servants greet the prince, Master Bennet." Everyone knelt in salute. Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet with displeasure, then walked straight inside. Eleanor Bennet stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. It turned out they had arrived at Prince Charles's residence. This meant the carriage had been stopped in front of the residence for quite some time. The journey from Harmony Hall to Prince Charles's residence couldn't have taken half a day. At this moment, Eleanor Bennet felt confused. What kind of man was he? Seemingly indifferent yet full of emotion? "Master Bennet, the weather is very cold. You should wear this cloak to avoid catching a cold," the old guard said respectfully. "Thank you, eunuch." Eleanor Bennet, not wanting to trouble herself, draped the cloak over her shoulders. A few guards escorted her into Prince Charles's residence. Eleanor Bennet walked slowly along the corridor illuminated by rows of lanterns, realizing the residence was far larger than she had imagined. The endless glow of the lanterns stretched for at least several miles. What she had seen before was merely a small corner. Following the guards, she entered a courtyard. Within it stood peculiar rock formations, and the gentle sound of flowing water filled the air. A few golden plum trees were in full bloom, adding vibrant colors to the courtyard. Eleanor Bennet turned her gaze toward a pavilion ahead. Describing it as a jade palace of splendor would not be an exaggeration. She noticed dozens of guards waiting outside the door, and as they saw the elderly eunuch leading her, they all bowed in unison. Eleanor Bennet observed that within this vast prince's residence, all the servants were eunuchs, not a single maid could be seen. Could it be that Charles King had a peculiar preference? But he seemed perfectly normal. Thinking of this, Eleanor Bennet's face flushed red. At the hot spring earlier, she had almost injured this rascal, so he must certainly be a normal man. "Your Highness, Lady Bennet has arrived," the old eunuch announced. "Very well. Let her in, and the rest of you leave." David King's voice echoed from inside. Eleanor Bennet stepped in alone. The doors were quickly shut, and everyone else departed. Eleanor Bennet noted how well-trained the staff were, but their evident fear of David King was unmistakable. Eleanor Bennet glanced at David King, who was seated on a chair. His outer robe had been removed, and he wore an ivory-white long robe with gold-threaded embroidered shoes, exuding vitality. She couldn't help but marvel at how quickly this man changed his attire. She removed her cloak herself. The room was indeed warm, with several golden brass heaters making it comfortably cozy. "Have you confined David King in the prince's residence?" Eleanor Bennet asked while pouring and sipping tea. "Only here can it be the safest and most secure." David King seemed in no rush to let Eleanor Bennet meet David King. She realized he had discreetly moved out of the palace. "I have sent word to the Bennet residence. For the next few days, you will stay in the prince's residence to treat me. Therefore, during this time, you are not allowed to go anywhere," David King declared, almost as if warning Eleanor Bennet. "That won't do, Daniel hasn't fully recovered yet." Eleanor Bennet's resolute attitude left David King somewhat annoyed. "I will take your senior brother back to the snow mountains to recuperate, you don't need to worry anymore." David King gave Eleanor Bennet no chance to refute. "Charles King, you..." Eleanor Bennet sat angrily on the bed, unwilling to say another word to him. "The incident at Eastyoung Courtyard has alarmed many people. If you want Daniel Moore to remain safe, you must listen to me." Charles King struck Eleanor Bennet's sore spot, making her snap back to reality. She suddenly realized she had forgotten about the watchful eyes. If the court discovered that David King had been swapped by her and Daniel Moore, would Alexander King spare them? Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King with some gratitude. Once again, he silently protected her. Currently, she was legitimately staying at the Duke's residence, and any suspicions were futile. Among those suspicious were, of course, Arthur Bennet and Edward King. Her disappearance over the past few days required an explanation, and Charles King had arranged everything in advance. Undeniably, her relationship with him was becoming inseparable, causing Arthur Bennet's plans to fail. What she always tried to escape from was now slowly engulfing her. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire Charles King's calculative and decisive nature. A man like him, aspiring to conquer the world, who could stand against him? Chapter 38, Grandmaster Anthony, Eunuch Owen, take Lady Bennet to rest. Charles King instructed as he left, and the elderly eunuch entered quietly. Eleanor Bennet glanced at Charles King, who was smugly sitting on the chair, and left in resentment. "One day, I, Eleanor Bennet, will no longer be under your control." Eleanor Bennet silently vowed to escape this predicament. Eunuch Owen led Eleanor Bennet past a pond, through a corridor, and to a small courtyard. The courtyard was filled with purple bamboo, reminding Eleanor Bennet of the Shaoxiang Pavilion in Dream of the Red Chamber. Eleanor Bennet entered the main room, where the furnishings were elegant and had a gentle beauty. Could this courtyard have been prepared for a woman? Eleanor Bennet went behind the screen, noticing a gilded bronze dressing table adorned with cosmetics, fragrances, and gold and silver jewelry. This confirmed her suspicion. "Lady Bennet, behind this main room is a warm pond. If you need anything, please feel free to use it." There are no maidservants in the Duke's residence, so if you need anything, just inform the eunuch outside the courtyard, Eunuch Owen said respectfully from the outer room. Thank you, Eunuch. Eleanor Bennet stepped out from behind the screen and bowed in gratitude. Lady Bennet, rest early. This residence is vast, and it's best not to wander around. Eunuch Owen's voice carried a hint of warning, which Eleanor Bennet quickly understood. Sir, take care on your way. Eleanor Bennet bid him farewell at the door, watching him leave before she began to stroll through the courtyard. Eleanor Bennet followed the cobblestone path towards the back of the main building. Sure enough, amidst the rock gardens, she saw steam rising. Eleanor Bennet quickly stepped in and found a hot spring surrounded by sheer curtains. This place was indeed very private. She approached the pool, her slender fingers gently skimming the water's surface, creating ripples. This pool seemed much smaller than the one in the bamboo forest, but was far more luxurious. Eleanor Bennet stood up, undressed, and slowly stepped into the water. The warmth enveloped her body, dispelling all fatigue. She held her breath and submerged herself, allowing her body to completely relax, slowly sinking. She recalled many past events. She remembered her days studying at Yale University, dancing with a violinist in Amsterdam, the pain of losing her parents, the tense moments on the operating table. Many familiar faces of family and friends flashed through her mind. She wanted to drift into sleep like this, not wanting to be Eleanor Bennet, just wanting to return to being Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet suddenly felt her body become weightless, as if she saw the scene of the car accident again, saw Amelia Grant's happy smile in a pristine white wedding dress. She wanted to go back, but then she heard someone calling her name. Eleanor Bennet awoke with a start, coughing a few times. She discovered Charles King was holding her. Charles King, why are you here? Eleanor Bennet retreated, covering her chest with her hands. Do you want to drown again? Charles King questioned, puzzled. She clearly knew how to swim, so why had she sunk without realizing it? Did she want to end her life? Eleanor Bennet realized she had indeed been drowning, which explained the weightlessness. If he hadn't saved her, could she have returned to her old world? Charles King, you're too nosy. As the thought of not being able to return crossed her mind, Eleanor Bennet's tears flowed uncontrollably. Even if you wish to die, it must be with my permission. Otherwise, I will have your entire Bennet family buried with you, Charles King threatened, gripping Eleanor Bennet's neck, filled with indignation. Why would she rather die than stay at Prince Charles's residence? Charles King, you're insane. Eleanor Bennet didn't understand the source of his rage. What did her life or death have to do with him? I will show you what madness truly is. Charles King released her, his gaze piercingly cold. Eleanor Bennet sensed a primal, intense desire from his eyes and hurriedly ran towards the edge of the pool. She couldn't lose her dignity in such a humiliating way. Charles King grabbed Eleanor Bennet from behind, his possessive kisses starting from her fair back, moving upwards, finally stopping at her earlobe. Tonight, I will make you submit. Charles King forcefully gripped her chest, kissing her fiercely, leaving her no chance to catch her breath. The entire pool steamed, mingling with a heady fragrance. Eleanor Bennet closed her eyes in despair, no longer able to muster even weak resistance. Charles King discarded his clothes, his primal instincts shattering all reason, desiring only to possess her, to savor all the pleasure she could offer. Eleanor Bennet was pressed against the pool's edge, the fire within her ignited by him. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes carrying a hint of bewilderment. Charles King was ready, his lower body pressing against Eleanor Bennet's stomach. Charles King, Eleanor Bennet has been dead for a long time. I am just a ghost who has traveled to this different world. Even if you possess her body, you will never have my heart. Eleanor Bennet's eyes, though filled with despair, still shone with determination. She didn't expect Charles King to spare her, she just wanted him to know that she truly wasn't Eleanor Bennet. Charles King's eyes were full of astonishment, but he became much more alert. Say that again. Charles King released Eleanor Bennet and watched her cautiously. I truly am not Eleanor Bennet. I am just a spirit attached to her body. The real Eleanor Bennet drowned long ago. I know medicine because in my previous life, I was a doctor. Everything you find different about me in this era is because I am not from this era. Eleanor Bennet poured out all the frustrations she had been holding inside, feeling much lighter. She dressed and left the hot spring, leaving Charles King still bewildered by her strange story. How could such an absurd thing exist in this world? Yet he couldn't deny that all his doubts about her now had a reasonable explanation. She really wasn't Eleanor Bennet. Charles King's mind was in turmoil as he suddenly recalled the things she had mumbled when drunk. Perhaps it was all true. Watching Eleanor Bennet's departing figure, for the first time, he felt a pang in his heart. Eleanor Bennet returned to her room, hugging a blanket while sitting on the bed, but her mind was filled with thoughts of Charles King. She hadn't expected Charles King to let her go, perhaps his arrogant nature had saved her. Did he believe in this bizarre story? If she weren't Eleanor Bennet, maybe their relationship wouldn't be so strained. Eleanor Bennet sat there in a daze until morning. Master Bennet! A shrill voice called from outside the door. Who is it? Eleanor Bennet sat on the bed, noticing a ray of sunlight and realizing that it was morning. A special servant has brought breakfast for Master Bennet, the person outside responded. Come in. Eleanor Bennet didn't move, still sitting on the bed. She watched the young servants bustle around for a while before leaving. Only the head servant stayed behind the screen, waiting for Eleanor Bennet's orders. You may leave now. I don't need your service anymore. Even though he wasn't a man, Eleanor Bennet still felt uncomfortable. Chapter 38, Enchanted in the Hot Spring, February 3rd, servant humbly takes their leave. The servant responded before departing. Eleanor Bennet stood up and changed into a clean outfit. After washing her face and brushing her hair, she went to the outer room to have breakfast. After a tiring night, her stomach was already growling with hunger. Once she was full, Eleanor Bennet stepped out of the room to enjoy the rare sunlight. Is it true that the prince wishes to summon me? Eleanor Bennet noticed a servant waiting in the courtyard. Could it be that David King was up to something again? Reporting to Lady Bennet, the prince has not summoned you. He only instructed us to serve you well. Oh, bring me a reclining chair. I want to bask in the sun. Eleanor Bennet felt a wave of relief upon hearing that David King did not wish to meet her. It would be best if they never crossed paths again. The attendant obeyed and left, returning shortly with a reclining chair and a fur blanket. Eleanor Bennet dismissed them, lying down on the chair to enjoy a rare moment of peace. Before she knew it, she had drifted off into a sweet slumber. When Eleanor Bennet woke up, it seemed the afternoon had already passed. She looked around at the silent surroundings, not a sound to be heard. Charles King had made no further moves since the previous night, leaving her feeling uneasy. Could it be that he truly believed her? Eleanor Bennet returned to her room and saw a few plates of snacks on the table. She sat down and began eating. If he never bothered her again for the rest of her life, she would truly thank the heavens. How was Daniel doing now? Eleanor Bennet lost her appetite as soon as she thought of Daniel Moore. Her face turned somber as she gazed at the purple bamboo forest outside the window. That cold expression of his hinted that his master would come. Daniel's injuries likely didn't need too much worry. Besides, he was a skilled physician himself and should be able to handle it. Thinking this, Eleanor Bennet felt a bit more at ease. Young lady, eating such fine snacks at the prince's residence, yet you look as if you've just lost your mother. A shadow flashed past the window and, in an instant, was seated in front of Eleanor Bennet. Who are you? Eleanor Bennet stepped back in shock as she stared at the elderly man with snow-white hair before her. This person's speed was even faster than Blood Shadow's. If it weren't broad daylight, she might have thought she had encountered a ghost. Young lady, you must be worried about Daniel Moore, aren't you? The old man laughed heartily, picking up a snack from the table to eat. Are you Daniel's eccentric master? Eleanor Bennet, hearing his words, immediately guessed his identity. Young lady, you are indeed very clever. The old man scrutinized Eleanor Bennet, a mysterious glint flashing in his eyes. Eleanor Bennet greets the elder. If he was Daniel Moore's master, respect was naturally due. Young lady, was it you who stitched up Daniel's wounds? The old man asked. Yes, may I ask how Daniel is doing now? Eleanor Bennet, hearing him mention this, assumed he must have met Daniel. He's fine. And it's thanks to you. A trace of doubt flickered in the old man's eyes. Having practiced medicine his entire life, it was the first time he had seen such a peculiar medical skill. It seems there was hope for the cold poison plaguing his stoic disciple to be resolved. Eleanor Bennet feels deeply ashamed. If it weren't for me, Daniel wouldn't have faced such a calamity. Eleanor Bennet replied with a tone of self-reproach. Young lady, he doesn't blame you. These are trials he was destined to face. The old man showed no sign of reproach, smiling warmly as he left. Eleanor Bennet watched him enter the courtyard, and in the blink of an eye, he vanished. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but be astonished. What kind of martial arts allowed someone to come and go without a trace? Daniel Moore and Charles King were both his disciples, so this martial art was undoubtedly extraordinary. Especially Charles King, whose internal energy seemed to consistently protect his heart meridian. Even when the cold poison in his body flared up, it never affected his heart meridian. Perhaps this was the real reason the ice soul snow silkworm couldn't claim his life. Charles King, having just returned from the water dungeon, had a glint of resentment in his eyes. David King's lips were truly sealed, refusing to divulge any information about Yenwu. He was desperate to know what agreement Eleanor Bennet had made with him back then. As Charles King stepped into the room, he immediately sensed a surge of internal energy attacking him. Charles King swiftly dodged and countered with a palm strike. However, his opponent effortlessly neutralized the attack. Charles, your martial skills have improved. The old man appeared, taking a seat on the grand chair. Master, you arrived quickly. Charles King remained cold, seating himself in the main position. The moment he entered, he recognized the formidable internal energy. If it wasn't the old man from the Celestial Mountains, Grandmaster Anthony, then who else in the world could it be? No one but him could evade the four shadows and freely enter Prince Charles's residence. You insolent brat, seeing your elder and not paying respects, such poor manners. Grandmaster Anthony feigned anger, but his attention was quickly drawn to a jade ornament placed on the side table. "How is senior brother's injury?" Charles King ignored him, turning to inquire about Daniel Moore. "Not bad, thanks to that young girl." Grandmaster Anthony fiddled with the jade piece, having long forgotten his earlier annoyance. "You've met Eleanor Bennett?" Charles King's eyes were filled with displeasure. "Daniel is worried about that girl, pleading with me." Grandmaster Anthony detected a hint of jealousy in Charles King's eyes and felt secretly pleased. This young man finally met someone who could handle him. An unusual excitement appeared on his face. "Rest assured, after the new moon night, I will take Daniel to the snow mountains to recuperate." Grandmaster Anthony put away the jade item, preparing to take it with him. It was a rare jade marrow he had searched for a long time. Why wait until after the new moon night? Charles King thought about Daniel Moore's feelings for Eleanor Bennett and felt troubled. "You brat, now that someone is helping you deal with the cold poison pain, you don't need your master anymore?" Grandmaster Anthony understood his meaning. This cold-hearted young man had indeed fallen in love. "Master, do you think there are souls in this world?" Charles King suddenly recalled Eleanor Bennett's shocking words that night, still feeling unsettled. All things in the world have spirituality, so why wouldn't there be? Grandmaster Anthony looked at Charles King's somewhat melancholic expression but couldn't discern the deeper meaning behind his question. "And what about soul possession?" Charles King continued to inquire. "Charles, are you doubting the girl from the Bennett family?" Grandmaster Anthony had heard some strange tales about Eleanor Bennett from Daniel. Her peculiar medical skills alone were enough to astonish others. All things are void, all laws are void. Why must you be obsessed with who she is? Everything has its destiny. Charles, think for yourself and don't do anything you'll regret for the rest of your life." Grandmaster Anthony sighed, as if touching his own heart. With a sorrowful look, he left. Charles King sat on the bed, his face gloomy. She wasn't Eleanor Bennett. Eleanor Bennett had drowned long ago. She was just a wandering soul traversing another world. In Charles King's mind, only Eleanor Bennett's voice from that night echoed. "Eleanor Bennett, whether you are human or ghost, destiny cannot escape the palm of this king." Charles King clenched his fist, and the jade pendant in his hand shattered into dust. "Someone, come here." Charles King commanded to the outside. "Master." Susie, Shadow, Dark Shadow, and Blood Shadow quickly appeared at the door. "Take Eleanor Bennett to see David King. Tell her that if she can find out the whereabouts of Jinhu and the records, I will let her leave. Otherwise..." Charles King didn't finish his sentence, but the four understood his intent. They were puzzled, as their master seemed to have feelings for Eleanor Bennett, yet he gave such a ruthless order. Despite their doubts, they didn't dare delay and hurried away. At this moment, Eleanor Bennett wasn't at Bamboo Pavilion but was strolling around the artificial lake in the royal residence. She stood on the pavilion, gazing out at the rippling green lake. The willow branches by the lake seemed to show a hint of tender green. Eleanor Bennett suddenly realized that the harsh winter was quietly departing. Spring didn't celebrate the Lunar New Year, so she had forgotten that spring was approaching. However, since spring was in the northern region, spring would arrive a bit later. "Eleanor Bennett, you have been dead too long." Her eyes glistened with a few transparent tears, disappearing with the wind. Her heart had completely cooled, unable to return to how it once was. Like a drowned Eleanor Bennett, everything seemed irretrievable. Eleanor Bennet coldly looked at the lake, tears like ice continuously falling down her cheeks. Her black hair swayed in the wind like flowing water. She slowly moved forward, step by step towards the railing. Her eyes were filled with darkness. If she were to fall like this, what could Charles King do to her? She was not Eleanor Bennet, and even if the entire Bennet family had to be buried with her, what good would it do? Why did she have to be controlled by this cold man at every turn? Eleanor Bennet gripped the railing tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. She couldn't bear to see so many innocent lives perish because of her. She completely believed that Charles King would do as he said. "Woman, don't do anything foolish." Charles King had seen her when she stepped onto the pavilion. He was still a bit uneasy, so he followed her. Seeing Eleanor Bennet's somewhat vague actions, he thought she intended to commit suicide and spoke up to stop her. "Charles King, is going to the underworld the only way to avoid you?" At this moment, Eleanor Bennet's emotions were already somewhat agitated, and seeing Charles King nearly caused her to collapse. "Woman, the lives of the entire Bennet family are tied to you." Charles King sensed something unusual about her and warned her, just wanting her not to do anything foolish. "Charles King, besides threatening, what else can you do?" Eleanor Bennet sneered coldly, continuing to move towards the railing. "If you want the lives of the entire Bennet family, then take them. After all, you are nothing but a demon." With those words, Eleanor Bennet jumped. Living like this was too exhausting, she would rather turn to dust and merge with the world. Seeing Eleanor Bennet leap, Charles King immediately followed without hesitation. In midair, Charles King quickly caught the falling Eleanor Bennet, holding her tightly. Eleanor Bennet looked at him in shock, unable to believe it was real. Charles King swiftly drew a flexible sword from his belt, embedding it into a pillar. Then, he leapt onto the sword's hilt, landing safely on the floor with Eleanor Bennet. The dangerous moment was resolved. "This woman, I already told you, even if you want to die, it must be with my permission." Charles King held Eleanor Bennet, feeling joy from losing and then finding her again. Her life and death had completely moved his heart. "Charles King, stop threatening me." Eleanor Bennet could no longer distinguish whether he was sincere or not. "Eleanor Bennet, no matter who you are, live well for me. Don't you want to save humanity? Don't you want to practice medicine and help others? If you die, what can you achieve?" Charles King's words no longer carried threats but instead offered advice. Her all-or-nothing attitude made him admire her. Eleanor Bennet looked at him, her cold gaze suddenly carrying an inexplicable warmth. Was this man acting? She silently vowed never to trust him again. Chapter 39, A heart yearning for death. Charles King left, and Eleanor Bennet watched his figure until it disappeared. Gradually, she calmed down. She had gone out to relieve her sorrow, but unexpectedly ended up doing something so extraordinary. Eleanor Bennet looked down from the tall pavilion, feeling a bit frightened as she stepped back. Earlier, she had been acting out of spite and couldn't even comprehend where that courage had come from. If Charles King hadn't appeared, she certainly wouldn't have jumped. Today, she was truly different, even she couldn't believe it. But why did Charles King jump without hesitation? That was the most unbelievable part. If he was just pretending, he was too immersed in the role. She could clearly feel his tension and worry. In that life and death moment, the feeling was strangely real. Eleanor Bennet's heart suddenly sank, and she inadvertently felt a strand of happiness, a feeling she had never experienced before. Eleanor Bennet returned to Bamboo Garden, stood outside the door looking in, and suddenly remembered an ancient poem, "The fine jade bears fruit, worthy of welcoming the phoenix. The green bamboo branches, each tree cool and refreshing. Water splashes on the steps, fragrance spreads. Do not disturb the shimmering bamboo shadows, the beautiful daydream is still long." Eleanor Bennet sighed softly. This scene was so reminiscent of Xiaoxiang. Eleanor Bennet stepped into the courtyard and saw the four shadows waiting. A trace of doubt arose in her heart. "Miss Bennet, by the Lord's order, we are here to take you to the water prison," Blood Shadow replied respectfully. Hearing the words, water prison, Eleanor Bennet's heart tightened. Indeed, he had turned against her without mercy, and she had overthought. Eleanor Bennet sneered coldly and followed the four people away. The four shadows led Eleanor Bennet to a secluded place in the mansion, surrounded by artificial mountains. Eleanor Bennet was puzzled. This place didn't look like a prison at all. "Miss Bennet, forgive us." Blood Shadow took out a black cloth and blindfolded Eleanor Bennet. She immediately realized there must be a secret here. "Miss Bennet, watch your step." Blood Shadow's voice sounded beside her ear, and Eleanor Bennet felt they were entering a cave. About half an incense stick later, the black cloth was removed from her face. In the dim light, she could finally see her surroundings clearly. It was a pool of water, with smooth, damp stone walls all around, and only a stone path about half a yard wide. Eleanor Bennet watched as the stone door in front of her slowly opened, revealing a man with disheveled hair tied to a stone pillar, half immersed in the water. Eleanor Bennet slowly stepped down, trying to see the person opposite her more clearly. "Who is he?" Eleanor Bennet asked Blood Shadow beside her. "David King," Blood Shadow replied coldly. Eleanor Bennet was startled, realizing Charles King wanted her to see him. Looking at the weakened David King, she couldn't help but feel pity. From the same bloodline, why must they slaughter each other? "Lord Bennet, the master wants you to." "No need to say more, I already know." Eleanor Bennet interrupted Blood Shadow, her gaze contemplative as she looked at David King. "Eleanor Bennet, you've finally arrived." Seeing Eleanor Bennet standing on the stone steps, David King laughed heartily. That laughter carried the calmness of someone facing death. "David King, were you waiting for me?" Eleanor Bennet could hear all the emotions in his words. "You truly are the woman of the nine-tailed fox." David King glared at Eleanor Bennet with resentment. "David King, do you really intend to take the secret of that ledger to the grave?" Eleanor Bennet had no intention of explaining herself. Her appearance at this moment rendered explanations unnecessary. "It's not that I want to, but I cannot escape death. If you can reveal the mastermind and hand over the ledger, perhaps there's a chance for change." Eleanor Bennet's words carried little conviction, even to herself. She wasn't Charles King, how could she make such decisions? "Haha, Eleanor Bennet, do you think you have the right to say such things?" Faced with David King's question, Eleanor Bennet was at a loss for words. Someone who could barely protect herself, what right did she have? "She indeed does not, but I do." Charles King had appeared in the dungeon at some point, descending slowly. "David King, name the mastermind and hand over the ledger, and I will spare your life." Charles King approached Eleanor Bennet, casting her a meaningful glance. "Ninth Prince, if you want to kill me, just do it. Don't waste words. The ghosts I've sent to the afterlife are no fewer than yours." David King's tone grew even more resolute upon seeing Charles King. "David King, do you truly believe I won't kill you?" Charles King seemed to have lost all patience, his killing intent radiating in all directions. Charles King, this matter requires further deliberation. Eleanor Bennet grasped his cold hand from behind, leaning close to whisper in his ear. Clearly, David King was intentionally provoking him. Someone unafraid of death, what else could they fear? Charles King steadied his emotions and pulled Eleanor Bennet out of the dungeon. David King watched in astonishment as Eleanor Bennet left. This woman could actually calm the emotions of the nine-tailed fox. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? Charles King couldn't contain himself and questioned Eleanor Bennet as soon as they exited the dungeon. Eleanor Bennet realized this was a secret passage, with the mechanism being the rockery she had noticed earlier. Charles King, for someone who does not fear death, any threat or torture is useless. Eleanor Bennet stood beside Charles King, her voice tinged with a trace of compassion. Charles King coldly glanced at Eleanor Bennet at that moment, the scene from the pavilion flashing through his mind. Could it be that she, too, was indifferent to life and death? Was that why she wasn't afraid of his threats? So, according to you, I have no way to deal with David King? Charles King, still uneasy from the events at the pavilion, turned his back to her, his icy voice concealing all emotions. There is, but it's a bit risky. Eleanor Bennet seemed slightly unsure of herself. Eleanor Bennet, come with me. Charles King stared at Eleanor Bennet before walking off. The four shadows hurriedly followed. Eleanor Bennet, puzzled, decided to follow Charles King. The two walked through the corridor, heading straight to the gates of the royal residence. Your Highness. Eunuch Owen quickly approached and bowed in greeting. Prepare the carriage. Charles King stood waiting outside the residence, and shortly after, a carriage appeared on the open ground in front of the estate. Shadow, Susie, stay in the residence. Charles King stepped onto the carriage, leaving Eleanor Bennet no choice but to follow him. The two boarded the carriage, but neither spoke a word. Charles King couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't she even asked anything today? Eleanor Bennet gazed out the window, breathing in the spring air, and gradually felt her melancholy lighten. Eleanor Bennet observed the direction the carriage was heading. It seemed to be moving toward the northern part of the city. Wasn't that where the commoners lived? What could Charles King possibly want to do there? The carriage stopped at the northern city gate. Charles King helped Eleanor Bennet down and instructed Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow to wait there. Together, he and she ascended the northern city wall. Eleanor Bennet looked out into the distance and saw nothing but rows of dilapidated, desolate houses stretching endlessly. Everywhere, people dressed in tattered clothing and living in poverty were visible. Was there truly such a destitute area within the capital? Compared to the prosperity within the city, this place was starkly contrasting. All of this made her truly understand the saying, the dogs of the rich eat leftovers, while the streets are littered with the frozen bones of the poor. But why had he brought her here? Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King, who stood just a step away, with confusion. His robe fluttered in the wind, and the usual coldness in his eyes was replaced by a hint of sorrow, a kind of sorrow that made one's heart ache. Eleanor Bennet, what you're seeing now is the truest face of Bryn. They once had homes and their own farmland. They could have lived peaceful, stable lives. But ever since the Carter family began seizing land and fields from the people, everything changed. They lost their homes, their lands, and were forced to drift to this desolate place, left to fend for themselves. Eleanor Bennet could sense his breathing becoming slightly uneven, his eyes filled with fury. Why doesn't His Majesty intervene? Why does he allow the Carter family to act so recklessly? Eleanor Bennet didn't understand. Alexander King didn't seem like a tyrant, so why did he tolerate the Carters? Do you really think he's a wise ruler? A glint of disdain flashed in Charles King's eyes. Eleanor Bennet could feel that the relationship between him and Alexander King was far from harmonious, contrary to the rumors. Charles King, you... Eleanor Bennet hesitated, unable to continue. Recalling the incident on the flower boat last time, her heart was filled with doubt. Do you know why Chris Carter was made Duke of Stirling, leading the three great ministers? It's not because he had great merits for the state, but because he helped my father kill my father, harm my brother, and seize the throne. Charles King's words shocked Eleanor Bennet, revealing that in the face of power, people can truly become so ruthless. The Carter family has been brazen and unrestrained for years because of this reason. The people in this city are all victims of the Carter family's land grabbing, and what she saw today is just the tip of the iceberg. I cannot let the Bryn Kingdom be ruined by an outsider's influence, Charles King exclaimed, striking the city wall forcefully, causing the stone to crack. So you want to obtain David King's records to overthrow the Duke of Stirling? Eleanor Bennet continued his thought aloud. Charles King, you claim the Duke of Stirling is greedy and cruel, but what about you? Just one of your estates could provide these people with a stable life. Eleanor Bennet knew that none of them truly cared for the people, it was merely a political struggle. Eleanor Bennet, what you see may not be the truth. I don't need to explain myself to you. Charles King, slightly angered, prepared to leave. Charles King, if you get the records, can you really bring the Duke of Stirling's faction to justice and let these people live peacefully? Eleanor Bennet looked at his retreating figure, deciding to trust him once. I will make it happen. Charles King stopped, responding firmly. Eleanor Bennet gazed at the setting sun, her heart filled with turmoil. She understood the significance of Charles King bringing her to this place. Charles King, release David King. Only by giving him a glimmer of hope can you achieve what you desire. Keeping him imprisoned is as good as killing him, utterly pointless. Eleanor must be his last trusted aide, and she is surely fleeing with the records now. Only David King knows where she is hiding. David King is not foolish, he will surely recognize this as a trap. Charles King expressed his doubts about Eleanor Bennet's plan. Charles King, this is what you must consider. Even the most secure prison has its weaknesses. Can all of David King's confidants truly be eliminated in one night? Eleanor Bennet spoke cryptically, knowing Charles King would understand. Eleanor Bennet left the city tower, a slight smile appearing on Charles King's face. Her thoughts were indeed delicate, but unfortunately, she was just a woman. Eleanor Bennet and David King got into the carriage, leaving the place. Eleanor Bennet kept looking out the window, her eyes following the poorly dressed, struggling people, her heart heavy. Can such a situation really be changed by eliminating a few corrupt officials? Perhaps the Bryn sky truly needs change. Eleanor Bennet glanced at David King, wondering if he could be that clear blue sky. David King noticed Eleanor Bennet's gaze, filled with expectation yet strangely pure and innocent. David King, I want to go back to the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet said, lowering her head awkwardly, aware she had been somewhat out of line earlier. Blood Shadow, to the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet was surprised he agreed, looking up in astonishment, catching his deep gaze. Both quickly looked away, remaining silent for the rest of the journey. The carriage stopped in front of the Bennet residence, and the butler, recognizing it as the carriage of the Duke's residence, hurriedly sent someone to fetch Arthur Bennet. Eleanor Bennet got off first, seeing the butler respectfully waiting outside. "Miss, you have returned." The butler bowed, occasionally glancing at the figure inside the carriage. Eleanor Bennet turned, seeing Charles King with a cold expression sitting inside, not intending to step out. At this moment, Arthur Bennet rushed over, shocked at the sight of the carriage behind Eleanor Bennet, quickly kneeling to pay respects. Arthur Bennet was taken aback when Charles King personally escorted Eleanor Bennet back to the mansion, leaving him somewhat unsure of how to react. "My Lord Bennet, please rise." "No need for such formalities. A few days ago, I had a relapse of an old illness and invited Dr. Bennet to stay at my residence for a few days. If there were any improprieties, I hope you can forgive me." Charles King spoke gently, dispelling any doubts Arthur Bennet had, allowing Eleanor Bennet to breathe a sigh of relief behind him. "The prince's health is of utmost importance. As a royal physician, it is my daughter's duty," Arthur Bennet replied respectfully. "There are matters at my residence that require my attention, so I won't intrude on your family reunion any longer." With that, the curtains of the carriage were drawn, and it departed, escorted by Blood Shadow on horseback. The Bennet family members hurriedly knelt to bid farewell. Only when the carriage disappeared around the corner did Arthur Bennet allow Eleanor Bennet to help him up. "Eleanor, you owe your father an explanation," Arthur Bennet said with a stern expression as he entered the mansion. Eleanor followed, thinking he must be referring to her sneaking out that day. It seemed Clara Young had been discovered. "Father, I'm quite tired today. Can we discuss it tomorrow?" Eleanor Bennet had finally escaped Charles King's watchful eyes and now just wanted some peace, not in the mood to address her father's suspicions. "Very well, Eleanor, go rest in your room," Arthur Bennet said, looking at her with a hint of doubt. Was she still his daughter? Eleanor bowed and excused herself, heading to her room, leaving Arthur Bennet confused. Between Prince Charles and Prince Edward, whom did Eleanor care for? He had a good sense of Prince Edward's intentions, but Prince Charles remained a mystery. As Eleanor returned to her room, she found Clara Young anxiously pacing outside. This young maid must have told Arthur Bennet everything. Luckily, Eleanor hadn't confided in her. With such a timid nature, Clara couldn't be relied upon in the future. "Miss, you're back," Clara Young exclaimed, tears welling up in her eyes. "All right, go to your room." Eleanor Bennet entered the room and immediately collapsed onto the large bed she had always longed for, not wanting to leave it for a moment. "Clara Young, I want to bathe." Eleanor Bennet looked up at the canopy above the bed, feeling like all she wanted was to sleep. "Miss, Clara Young will prepare it right away." Clara Young hurriedly left, and the room instantly became quiet. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but recall the scene at the North Tower. Today, she clearly sensed that the relationship between Alexander King and David King was far from harmonious as rumored. Alexander King's sinister and malicious nature was completely hidden by his saintly appearance. Eleanor Bennet suddenly thought of the mysterious deaths of concubine Violet and the Empress. Could all these be related to Alexander King? Alexander King was not born of the Empress Dowager. Back then, the Carter family dared to risk the crime of treason to help Alexander King seize the throne. So, what promises did Alexander King make? Alexander King could mercilessly kill David King, yet he did nothing to the Carter family. Was it simply because there was no evidence? If one wanted to accuse, finding a reason wouldn't be difficult, especially since the Carter family was indeed guilty of numerous crimes. Could it really be so hard to uncover some clues? Or perhaps the Carter family held some leverage over Alexander King? Eleanor Bennet pondered this complex relationship, but every thread seemed to be severed. Maybe she truly had to search for clues herself. Miss. Clara Young called out several times beside Eleanor Bennet, but there was no response. Miss. Clara Young panicked and gently shook Eleanor Bennet, who was lying on the bed, startling her awake. Clara Young, you scared me to death. Eleanor Bennet sat up, removed her clothing, and stepped into the warm bath. Miss, what happened to you? Why are there so many bruises on your body? Clara Young looked at Eleanor Bennet's chest in astonishment and asked. Perhaps I've been eating too much seafood lately and had an allergic reaction. Clara Young, you mustn't tell anyone about this. Eleanor Bennet quickly covered her chest with a handkerchief, her face flushed. She suddenly realized her body was covered with love marks left by Charles King from that night. Fortunately, Clara Young was still naive and probably wouldn't realize it. Clara Young, is Mother in the residence? Eleanor Bennet hurriedly changed the subject, submerging herself entirely in the water. The madam is in the residence. Clara Young, seemingly unaware of Eleanor Bennet's odd behavior, scattered flower petals into the water. Go to the Buddhist temple and tell Mother that I've returned. Tell her I will visit her tomorrow morning to pay my respects. Assure her not to worry. Thinking of Madam Bennet, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Right away, miss. Clara Young responded and left. Watching her leave, Eleanor Bennet emerged from the water. Looking at the pitiful marks on her body, she couldn't help but silently curse Charles King as a devil. He had almost devoured her completely. In this era, she would have been considered impure. Luckily, she was a modern woman, and this didn't mean much to her. She decided to think of it as being bitten by a dog. At this thought, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but laugh. He was indeed a devilishly handsome dog, capable of making anyone lose their senses. Eleanor Bennet stood up and changed into clean clothes. She quickly snuggled into the warm blankets. By this time, Clara Young had returned and, seeing Eleanor Bennet's hair still wet, couldn't help but nag a little. Miss, you'll catch a cold like that. Clara Young helplessly looked at Eleanor Bennet, then climbed onto the bed to dry her hair. Clara Young, let's sleep together tonight. Eleanor Bennet sat up, her long eyelashes fluttering. Miss, how can that be? Clara Young looked at Eleanor Bennet playfully, feeling a bit flustered. Why not? Sleeping together will be warmer. Eleanor Bennet pulled Clara Young under the covers, feeling as if she had returned to her college days. Back then, she and Amelia Grant often shared a bed, chatting and joking. She never saw Clara Young as just a servant, but more like a sister. Although she couldn't share everything with Clara Young, she always wished for a good sister. This world has too many burdens she couldn't accept. She was trying to adapt, but her heart grew lonelier. Sometimes, living a simple life is a kind of happiness. After some playful moments, Eleanor Bennet and Clara Young both fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 40, Canceling the engagement in the silent peach blossom manor, the cold wind rustled the branches, creating an eerie atmosphere. Several shadows flickered in, breaking the silence. Mark pays respects to the sect leaders. A man in black knelt down to salute. "Mark, you've worked hard these past years while hiding beside the crown prince," said Blood Shadow, the head of the Cold Shadow sect. "Mark is willing to sacrifice for the Cold Shadow sect," the man replied with a determined expression. "Mark, you have a new mission now." Illusion spoke up. "Please instruct me, sect leader." Mark glanced at Illusion, a sense of doubt rising in his heart. It was rare for all 4 sect leaders to appear at once. Could a major event be approaching? "Where is the master?" Charles King glanced around but did not see Grand Master Anthony. "He went out this morning and hasn't returned yet," Daniel Moore replied casually. "How are your injuries?" Charles King wasn't sure when their relationship had become so distant. "At least I'm not dead yet." Daniel Moore laughed, acknowledging the growing distance between them. "Senior brother, go back to the Snow Mountains. Your nature doesn't suit this place full of schemes." Charles King's tone was much more gentle, offering advice rather than giving orders. "Charles, you know that's impossible. Wherever she is, I will be there." Daniel Moore did not hide his admiration for Eleanor Bennett. "Senior brother, there's absolutely no chance between you and her. Let it go." Charles King's tone carried a hint of warning, and any trace of goodwill from moments ago had completely vanished. "Daniel, listen to Charles. Come back to Snow Mountains with me." Grandmaster Anthony, who had returned unnoticed, seemed to have overheard their entire conversation. This young lady was truly remarkable, managing to captivate both of his disciples. "Master, Daniel Moore looked at Grandmaster Anthony in shock, not expecting him to fail to understand his feelings either. "Daniel, the young lady from the Bennett family is certainly not destined for you. Don't hold on to this anymore." Grandmaster Anthony interrupted Daniel before he could finish, as if he already knew everything. "Master, tomorrow you should take senior brother back to Snow Mountains." Charles King hadn't anticipated that Grandmaster Anthony would share the same view as him. He indeed had ulterior motives, but why was that? "You ungrateful brat, are you really sure you won't need your master on the night of the new moon?" Grandmaster Anthony feigned reluctance, but deep down, he knew this stubborn disciple was truly his father Alexander King's son. "Regardless, my poison won't kill me anytime soon, nor will it be cured immediately. If you stay here, it'll only waste more of your energy," Charles King said with a trace of despair, casting a glance at Daniel Moore before leaving. Hopefully, tonight's words would sink in. No matter who Eleanor Bennett was, she was already part of the story. As for Daniel Moore, he could still step away from it entirely. Grandmaster Anthony watched Charles King leave with concern, then turned his gaze to the silent Daniel Moore lying on the bed. Worry filled his heart. Perhaps he needed to meet Eleanor Bennett one more time. Eleanor Bennett woke up early, had breakfast, and then went to Mrs. Bennett's Buddhist temple. Unexpectedly, she found Arthur Bennett there. Eleanor was surprised. He rarely visited the temple. Was he waiting for her today? "Father, don't you have court duties today?" Eleanor asked casually, noticing Arthur in his casual attire. "Eleanor, it's already quite late. I've been back from court for a while." Arthur smiled, sipping his tea. Eleanor glanced outside, realizing she had made a mistake. This strange place didn't even have a clock. How could she tell the time by just looking at the sun? "Mother, how have you been lately?" Eleanor nestled into Mrs. Bennett's embrace, acting playfully. "Eleanor, it's been so long since I've seen you." Mrs. Bennett's eyes were filled with love. "Mother, there are many affairs at the palace. I'll visit more often when I'm free," Eleanor reassured her. Madam, Eleanor's status is different now. Don't be too hard on her, Arthur added. Master. The butler stood at the door, seemingly with something to report. What is it? Arthur asked. Sir, young Master William is requesting to see you outside the residence. William Clark? Arthur was startled, showing displeasure as he glanced at Eleanor. Master, William, he... Mrs. Bennet hesitated, worriedly glancing at Eleanor. Eleanor quickly remembered that William Clark was the scholar she had angered last time. Why was he visiting the Bennet residence now? Invite him to the main hall, I'll be there shortly. Arthur instructed the butler. Eleanor was quite surprised, he had always refused William Clark at the door before. Why the change today? Master, why are you? Mrs. Bennet was also puzzled. Although she was his aunt, there wasn't much she could do. You don't know yet, madam. William Clark topped the imperial examination this year, becoming the top scholar. He might soon receive an official title. He's brought honor to the Clark family, Arthur said with admiration, though his face showed no joy. Arthur Bennet calmly sipped his tea and said, I don't recall any significant ties between the Clark family and the Bennet family that need to be broken. Beside him, Mrs. Bennet appeared quite anxious. You must be forgetful, Aunt. I'm here to cancel the childhood engagement between the Bennet and Clark families. William Clark smiled, but his words were laced with provocation. The engagement between Eleanor and you was annulled long ago. Why are you bringing it up today? Arthur Bennet immediately realized that William Clark's visit had no good intentions. Aunt, you're mistaken. An engagement can't be unilaterally annulled. Today, I've brought the official document to formally end the engagement with Eleanor Bennet, William Clark said, his smile filled with satisfaction as he watched Arthur Bennet's face darken. In Britain, girls whose engagements were broken were considered tainted, and the humiliation the Bennet family had caused him would be avenged today. William Clark, you're outrageous.